the disasters on the policy front racking up one after the other. We have a border crisis on our southern border, an absolute disaster because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won't enforce the law. We have gas lines across the country because of their failed energy policies and their failure to protect critical infrastructure. We have a burgeoning inflation crisis that is hitting people across the country and especially seniors. And now we have a shooting war in the Middle East. Every one of these is caused by mistaken and disastrous political decisions from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Just 6 months ago, the world was very different. Just 6 months ago, we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. Just 6 months ago, America was the leading producer of oil and natural gas and an energy superpower on the global stage. And just 6 months ago, peace was flowering throughout the Middle East. The Abraham Accords were historic peace agreements between Israel and her Arab neighbors. And they were the result of strong and clear policies from the Trump administration. Two decisions in particular by President Trump set the stage for the Abraham Accords. Number one, the decision to move our embassy to Jerusalem, the once and eternal capital of Israel, which President Trump made. Presidents of both parties had promised to do that. Presidents of both parties had broken that promise. I was there in Jerusalem when we opened the embassy. And it was a clear and unequivocal statement to our friends and to our enemies that America stands resolutely with Israel. And then secondly, that same week, President Trump withdrew America from the disastrous Obama-Iran nuclear deal, the single most important national security decision made by President Trump. Those two decisions set the stage for the Abraham Accords. When the Abraham Accords were signed at the White House, I was there. I spoke with the ambassadors and foreign ministers from the UAE and from Bahrain. Both said virtually the identical thing. Both said, it is now clear to us that America stands unequivocally with Israel. We want to be friends with America. Therefore, we will be friends with Israel. That clarity, that strength produces peace. What did Joe Biden do? He came in and immediately began undermining Israel. He immediately began sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, which is in bed with Hamas terrorists. And he set as his number one foreign policy goal re-entering the disastrous Obama-Iran nuclear deal and sending billions of dollars to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who chants death to America and death to Israel. As a direct result of those failed decisions, we now have hundreds and hundreds of rockets raining down on innocent men, women, and children in Israel from Hamas, funded by Iran. The Biden administration's mistakes produced this crisis. And what is Joe Biden doing today? Today, he called Prime Minister Netanyahu not to say America stands with Israel, not to say we have your back, not to say you have a right to defend yourself against terrorism, but instead a tough call, as the administration is now proudly trumpeting, where President Biden condescended and lectured to Prime Minister Netanyahu and urged him to stop defending Israel against the terrorists. Let me be clear. There is no moral equivalency between terrorists murdering innocent civilians and a sovereign nation defending itself against those terrorists. Some years ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu put it powerfully when he observed the difference between Israel and Hamas. They use their citizens to protect their missiles. We use our missiles to protect our citizens. And Hamas regularly stores missiles in kindergartens, in hospitals. They use human shields. And what do the Democrats do? The Democrats act as their press agents. The Democrats spread propaganda because human shields are all designed locating military assets where innocent Palestinian civilians are likely to be the inadvertent targets of any act to strike back against the terrorists. It is Hamas that is killing these human shields. And the Democrats and the press are happily parroting that propaganda language. Several years ago, I led a bipartisan resolution that passed unanimously in the Senate condemning the use of human shields as a war crime. It is a war crime, but right now the Democratic Party is governed and led by the extreme left, by the Squad, by AOC and Tlaib and Omar, whose statements might as well be issued on behalf of Hamas. They are accusing Israel of engaging in terrorism, defending your citizens from violent terrorist attacks is the right of Israel. And I will say for every Senate Democrat, they have an opportunity right now to decide where do they stand. Just a minute ago, I was speaking with a reporter who relayed that Chuck Schumer had told him, "I don't want to answer any questions on Israel." Well, I bet he doesn't. I bet he doesn't because he's so scared of AOC primarying him from the left that he doesn't want to say anything to anger the anti-Israel extreme left in the Democratic Party. Now is a time for men and women with courage to step up and say, we stand with Israel. And by the way, now is a time when the Biden administration ought to step forward and say we're going to replenish the Iron Dome munitions that are saving thousands of lives by intercepting these terrorist rocket attacks. Instead of attacking and belittling and undermining the nation of Israel, President Biden ought to be standing with Israel and replenishing the Iron Dome munitions. And with that,
Mr. Turner.
Right. I just want to echo that sentiment and certainly lament the attacks that have been levied against our colleague Lee Stefanik on this panel, which have been vile and hateful. For those of you keeping score at home, the effort to accuse our president of coercion, extortion, or bribery with these witnesses as we now come to the closing session of this basically break down as follows. We have Kent and Ambassador Taylor who spoke of hearsay. Their hearsay of these matters that they said that they had heard were all statements that they'd heard from others who have also testified in front of us. So there's no one that's missing. There's no one out there. Kent and Taylor basically said that they'd heard it from Morrison and Sondland. Morrison indicated he'd heard it from Sondland. Sondland testified yesterday he'd heard it from no one on the planet. Vindeman and Morrison both have direct testimony of the phone call with the President of the United States. Beyond that, they only had contact with Sondland, and again, Sondland indicated he had contact with no one on the planet. Volker testified that he did have direct contact both with the Ukrainians and with the President of the United States and indicated that the President of the United States did not condition either a phone call, a meeting, or aid upon Ukraine undertaking investigations, and also testified that the Ukrainians did not believe that either. We also have the direct statements from the President of Ukraine and the Foreign Minister that they did not feel any pressure to undertake investigations, and we also have the evidence that we're all very much aware of, which is they did not undertake any investigations. We also have Yovanovitch and Dr. Hill. Yovanovitch obviously left before the time period. Dr. Hill, we appreciate your being with us today, and Mr. Holmes. Dr. Hill, you have provided me probably the greatest piece of evidence that's before us to illustrate the problem with hearsay. So you said, based on questions and statements, I have heard some of you on this committee, that'd be us, appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country. And perhaps somehow, for some reason, it was Ukraine. So this is it was held up by Devin Nunes. This is the report on Russian active measures that was voted on by all of us. It begins with this sentence. In 2015, Russia began engaging in a covert influence campaign aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Every one of us, a little small, like, effort on your part, Dr. Hill, and you would have known that what you just said was not true, what you had heard, but you felt the need to put it in your 8-page statement before you went on to tell us a bunch of other things that you heard about other people, no matter how convinced you were of, also which were not necessarily true. One of which was that you said that Ambassador Sondland met with Giuliani. Actually, Ambassador Sondland testified here that he had not, as ambassador, met with Giuliani. He'd briefly met him in his lifetime by shaking his hand, and Giuliani Giuliani issued a statement that they had never met either. This is the problem with no matter how convinced we are, Dr. Hill, no matter how much we believe we know that what we've heard is true, it is still just what we've heard. But so far in this hearing, in this series of hearings, the only thing that we have is Volker saying, I spoke to the president and I've spoke to the Ukrainians, neither of which believed that aid was conditioned, neither of which believed that the president was requiring it, and Ambassador Sondland said no one on the planet told him that that was the case. That's the sole evidence. Now, I got to tell you, the one thing that's interesting is Ambassador Sondland did say it's his belief that a meeting with the president was conditioned upon investigations. Ambassador Volker, who I think is a man of very significant integrity, said that that was not the case. Now, even if Ambassador Sondland is correct that somebody, and Dr. Hill, you testified, and again, it's hearsay, you don't know, that supposedly Mulvaney told him that, because he didn't testify to that. But let's say somebody beside the president told him that. You guys want to be the laughingstock of history to impeach a president of the United States because he didn't take a meeting? Oh, please, dear God. Please undertake that. Now, Mr. Holmes, I got to tell you, you say that you're there.
Is there a question for Dr. Hill?
Mr. Holmes, in your testimony, you said that Sondland said he loves your ass and also said he'll do anything that you want. Mr. Holmes, that information had nothing whatsoever to do with the subject matter of any of these hearings. It was anecdotal. It was extraneous. Your statements that your interests are protecting Ukraine are very dubious when you embarrass President Zelensky by making those statements that you didn't have to make. Who cares that Ambassador Sondland said that? And you know you didn't embarrass Ambassador Sondland, you embarrassed Zelensky, because you know he got asked this question in his own country, and people are hearing that statement as if it's true.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
It's totally dubious of you to do that.
Mr. Carson, you are recognized.
I yield back.
Get to answer.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for your